Chapter 6. So far, what we are learning is about the nefesh habahamis, the nefesh hachiyunis, the animal or animating soul, which apparently is responsible for a lot of our troubles, actually, as it turns out. So we started off by saying that this is a reflection. Everything that exists on the positive side has a reflection or a counterpart that exists on the negative side. So on the positive side, we have an neshama, which is comprised in nefesh elikis, the divine soul, which is comprised of 10 soul powers and operates using the medium of 3 different interfaces or 3 different garments. And now we're seeing that the truth is there is the equal opposite force, which is what we call the nefesh hachiyunis, or the nefesh habahamis, the animal or the animating soul. And it also has 10 components. And this is where we left off last week. We said that there are 10 components to that part of the soul, or to that soul, to this animal soul of ours. And the nature of these 10 components is that they are the reverse of how it is in the healthy side, on the divine side. Now remember, the conversation we're having is to move in the direction of understanding what makes something holy, what makes something unholy, and that way to work out which part of our life and which part of our behavior is associated with holiness, which part of our behavior is disassociated from holiness. And we want to try and get away from words that people tend to use, like impure. Even though we'll use the word, but let's try and get away from the simplistic way that people translate what exactly those words mean. Impure. It's not like dirty or unhygienic or something like that. So that's effectively what we're going to be doing as part of our conversation over here. In order to get there, we need to understand what it is that comprises the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic soul. So this evening we're going to start off by focusing on the process. How does the process work in this so-called animal soul? Now remember, again, we said that there are 10 soul powers in the animal soul, just like there are 10 soul powers in the divine soul. But we did say there's a big difference. In the divine soul, they're called koichos nefesh, which effectively implies that they are meaningful, healthy, spiritual, koichos, they're powers, they're energies, they have substance, they have gravitas, they have power, they have ability, potential. Whereas the minute you get into the animal soul, we call them impure crowns, which has a double meaning. First of all, it implies the sense of impurity, something which is obviously not healthy. And crowns, they operate almost remotely outside of the system, which effectively means that whatever there might be, whatever may exist in the realm of soul powers, even within this animalistic soul, it's not integrated. It's not part of the system. It's kind of like almost plugging into something external. And you'll see that this becomes a theme that consistently recurs. Whenever we talk about the world of impurity, you'll always see there's a disconnect. That's a great way to describe it. There's an element of disconnect. And when you're in the world of holiness and purity, there's always a sense of synthesis. So that's something worth keeping in mind, because anytime we explore what happens in the healthy side, we can expect things to be harmonious. And anytime that we explore something that is in the realm of the impure, the unholy, we can expect it to be something that is jarring and something that doesn't quite fit, doesn't quite work. But for the purposes of our conversation this evening, we want to know, how do the 10 powers of the nefesh habahamis, the so-called animal soul, how do these 10 powers work? So let's have a look. I'm going to go back a drop just to get the flow again. So we'll start from the 4th line. First word on the 4th line. Just like the nefesh elikis comprises 10 soul powers and uses 3 interfaces, thought, speech, and action, in order to engage with the world, kach, in the same way, the nefesh de sitra achra, the soul that comes from the so-called other side, miklipas noiga, which is from a world of obscuring of godliness, which is what we call the so-called klippa, the so-called shells or peels of life. And we said it is hamluveshus bedamo adam, the interface or the residence of the soul is in the human bloodstream. That's what keeps the neshama inside, or this nefesh habahamis inside the body. We said it's also comprised of 10 elements, and we call those 10 elements the 10 impure crowns. Now let's unpack. What are the 10 impure crowns? What do they mean? How do they operate? Shehein, so they are Sheva Midos Ro'os. They are first and foremost 7 inappropriate or unhealthy or toxic personal subjective responses. Midos Ro'os. Personal subjective responses. Now, when we were in chapter 3 analyzing the nature of the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, there we said that the 10 soul powers are Chochmah, Bina, and Das. That's where we began. We first described the intellectual value of that soul, because the implication was that that's where its strength lies. Its strength lies that the divine soul has this unique ability to be able to see things objectively and to understand them in a meaningful way. And then from there move to the next stage of whatever development has to take place. Here we're discovering that the animalistic soul starts in the world of midos. Now, most people will translate midos as emotions, and they'll talk about the fact that the person has 7 emotions, which isn't a great translation. First of all, the word midah doesn't actually mean an emotion. The actual translation of the word midah is a measurement. So there are 7 measures by which we could define the human being, if you want to be very literal in the translation. 7 measures. So you can measure how tolerant is a person, how kind is a person, how generous is a person. There'll be one area of measurement. Another measurement is how focused is a person, how self-disciplined is a person, etc. So there's 7 categories that we could use to analyze the values of a person. What we do know about all 7 of these is that they tend to be subjective. Person always, people say these things. It's very interesting when you speak to people. Have you ever met a person who says, I actually don't think I'm a good person? It doesn't happen very often. Occasionally people say that to the rabbis. And Rabbi, I'm a bad Jew. Sometimes people say that. Usually as a way of wriggling out of a Jewish responsibility. I'm a bad Jew, so I'm a write-off. I don't have to do these things. But typically people say, I think I'm a good person. It's typically, I think I'm a good person. Okay. Hold on a second. How do you know? How do you know you're a good person? So the reality is that people tend to have a subjective view of themselves. So I feel justified to be tolerant and kind and benevolent to that person or to that group of people. And I feel equally justified not to have the same attitude to those people. So I'm a good person, right? Why am I a good person? Because I'm good to good people by my assessment. So the point is that midos tend to be subjective and impulsive. Very often when a person says, so-and-so is a tzaddik, have you ever heard people speak that way? So-and-so is a tzaddik. They're an unbelievable human being. If we had to put that into Google Translate, it would probably come out as, that person has always been nice to me. It's not an objective sense of how developed that person is in their spiritual growth. I think they're a tzaddik because they were good to me. That person is a no-goodnik. Why? Because they looked at me the wrong way. They seated me at the wrong table at their child's bar mitzvah. So that's it. They're no longer a good person. So the nature of midos is to be highly subjective. That's the starting point of the nefesh habahamis. That's the world that it lives in. Impulsive, self-interested responses and assessment of life. That's the nefesh habahamis. Is it good for me? Not is it good. Is it good for me? Does it feel good? Does it align with my particular needs or my particular outlook on life, etc.? And as we learned last week, as we learned last week, those 7 traits as they manifest in the animal soul are all associated with one of the 4 major areas, which we call the 4 basic elements, that are unhealthy elements. So the fiery heat of anger, aggression, or alternatively of ego, of that sense of gaiva, as we call it, where a person is very full of themselves. Or it might come from the realm of water, which we described as temptation and pleasure-seeking, etc., as we already saw in the first chapter. So before we get into the details, we already have a sense that this animal soul is not a naturally healthy environment. It's not a naturally healthy entity. But v'seichel hamoilidon hanechlek l'sholosh. The reality is that a person is incapable of having a subjective view on something unless they have given it some thought. So there has to be seichel involved. Doesn't have to be the most advanced seichel. There has to be some seichel, some intellectual process. And that intellectual process, is split into three categories: shein chochma, bina, v'da'as, which are the three stages, the identical three stages to what you have in the godly soul: the ability to innovate or to grasp a new idea, to be inspired by something, which is called chokhmah; the ability to research and to understand something thoroughly and get a three-dimensional view of what it is, which is bina; and the ability to integrate things from the abstract into the personal, which is das. Except that when you deal with this nefesh abahamis, this animalistic soul, then it is mekor hamidos. That is intellect designed to facilitate emotional subjective responses. Now, that's very valuable information for us, because effectively what that tells us is there are two ways that intellect could operate. One is intellect in its purest, most pristine form. Intellect as intellect should be, which means seeking truth, seeking to understand, arriving in an environment without an opinion so that we could objectively derive real insight or meaning or truth. That's how seichel should be. So, for example, what is the most intellectual realm of logic that exists? Let's say mathematical logic, right? So you don't arrive at a mathematical lecture and say, okay, listen, I really need 1 + 1 to equal 3. It's very important because it's the only way I'm going to balance my books. Otherwise, the tax man's going to have issues. I have to be able to find. So therefore, I'm going to go to this professor of mathematics who's giving a lecture, and he will help me to be able to work out how 1 + 1 equals 3. You say, Meshugana. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a subjective matter. It's empirical. 1 and 1 equals 2. It's empirical. That's it. I could show it. I could illustrate it to you. So that's pure seichel. That's so to speak, the most appropriate manifestation of seichel. To understand things in their purest, most honest form. The nefesh habahamis uses a less honest kind of seichel, which is, let me understand so that I can have a response, a reaction, a feeling, an opinion. It's a different kind of seichel. And that, he explains, ki hamidos hein lefi erech haseichel. The reality of the human experience is that the state of our midos / emotions / subjective responses will always be absolutely relative to the intellect that precedes it. He'll give us a couple of examples. Let's start off with this. Ki hakoton, when you're dealing with a child is always going to be an example of an immature intellect, right? Children don't have the maturity to look at things and see them purely objectively. Children, they're still undeveloped, they're still learning, they still see the world through very simplistic eyes. So what does a child love in life? Children wish for and they love little things that don't have real value. Halavai, we outgrow it, right? Over the holiday of Shavuos, so many shuls like ours, we have we do an ice cream party for the children on the first day of Shavuos. That way the kids come to shul and they get to hear the 10 Commandments, and it's very nice. So how do you get kids through the door? You offer them ice cream. Is ice cream something of real value? I don't know. We could possibly debate that. There might be some people here who will say, absolutely, ice cream has value. It's one of the most important things that was ever invented, and we should protect ice cream. Okay. But objectively, ice cream is not something of real value. That's what children like. They like ice cream. Do children like investing in stocks? Not really. Do children like to sit and have meaningful conversation? Not so much. They'd much rather be playing with their dolls or running around the garden, creating imaginary forts, or whatever it is that they do. So the kind of things that a child loves in life are generally things that are quite cheap and transient. Why is that? That reason for that is because a child's intellect is not yet developed enough to appreciate that there are more valuable things than an ice cream, or a Barbie doll, or a Lego set, or whatever it may happen to be. In other words, what the Alter Rebbe wants to illustrate to us is you can't love something, desire something that you haven't begun to appreciate intellectually. And that's why at the end of the day, as a person goes through life, and as we learn more, so we expand the range of things that we're attracted to. Not only expand in terms of how many things are in that range, but also the range of depth that is associated, right? The range of depth that is associated with those things that we love. So I always think of it like this. I always think, imagine you have two adult friends, and they come along, they're getting together because they've got a very important meeting. The meeting has to do with the future of a business that they want to launch together. The business has the potential to generate an absolute fortune of money. So they get together, the one friend goes to the other friend's house, and because they're going to have a long meeting, and it happens to be during the day, so they both the one brings his children to play with the other one's children, and they're going to have this meeting. Okay? So picture the scene. You've got the two adults, and the two adults are talking about this great, amazing business prospect. And of course, they've got to work through many, many details on how they're going to get investors and what are the risks that they have to ensure that they avoid and how they're going to market it. Many, many details that take a long time to iron out. While they're having this very deep, meaningful conversation, the two kids are sitting on the floor and playing with their little action figures or their little dinky cars or whatever it is that they're playing with. And they play like for an hour. During that time, they have built worlds and destroyed them. And the two adults are still sitting at the table, and they're still hacking away, talking about things that have no interest to the children, talking about things that the children don't understand. So after an hour, the one child turns to the other child and says, I really hope that we never become like them. I never want to stop playing with the Lego or the action figures or whatever the case is. Because because the childish mind is too limited, it's too immature to dream of the possibility of something that is completely beyond their stage in life, or the here and now, or the things that seem entertaining. Can't imagine it's possible. So therefore, if the mind can't imagine things that are more valuable, it's not possible for them to have a love or interest in something which is of greater value. All of our personal responses to stimuli in life are directly relative to the depth of our understanding about life. So that's why, for example, you'll see kids, you take a child to a hotel. Don't know if you've ever done this. It's an interesting experiment. You go take a child to a hotel. What's the first thing they get excited about? They're going to take the little shampoos home. That's the whole thing. Meanwhile, the adult appreciates the value of being in a hotel. That's valuable, especially if it's a comfortable hotel. The child thinks the most amazing thing that ever happened, we got the shampoos to take home. So what Alter Rebbe wants us to understand is that the nefesh habahamis is the child in the story. The animal soul is immature. The divine soul, the nefesh elokis, deep maturity. The animal soul is very immature. So the only things that excite and attract it are things of little value. As the cliche goes, small things entertain small minds. So the first example he's just given us is an example that is associated with the first of the 10 soul powers, which is what we call chesed, which is the entire genre of things that attract us towards. So we get attracted towards people, we love things, we love experiences. Anything that draws us towards something, that is called chesed / ahava, kindness or love. In the case of the nefesh habahamis, it loves rubbish and it is tolerant of nonsense. V'chein miskais umiskatzev midvorim ketanim. Now the exact same thing occurs when you go to the opposite side of the spectrum, which is gevura. Gevura is associated with discipline in a healthy way. If it's healthy gevura, it's about focus and discipline. If it's unhealthy gevura, then it's about anger and aggression. What makes a child angry? Little things. Little things. You gave him more ice cream than you gave me. Or, it's not fair. I don't want to go to sleep right now. Or their little thing that they making out of Lego collapses. Oh, it's a whole thing. It's a disaster, the drama, the yelling, the gnashing of teeth. Why? Because the immature mind allows a reaction that's an immature reaction to get angry at something that's actually not worth getting angry about. Now, at this point, anybody who's a little introspective might be squirming in their seat and feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Hey, hang on one second. Have we really outgrown the child? So, for example, I think I may have told you the story. Some time ago, I'm driving and I stop at a red light. And coming from the other side, approaching the intersection, was an older woman driving her car, and she was taking her time. Behind her was a guy who was probably 10, 15 years her junior, and he must have been in a terrible rush because you could see his face, and he was shaking his hands, and the windows were closed. You couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was shouting. He was clearly cursing the woman in front of him for driving so slowly, where he had this urgent thing that he had to get to. And I just remember thinking, there's certain times where you wish you had a dash cam on your car. And then you wish you had the person's address that you could actually send them the video and show them that, number one, the woman he was so angry at was absolutely oblivious to his tantrum in his car. So it was a waste of time. He's screaming, gesticulating, this and that, whatever. And she's completely oblivious. The rest of us who stopped at the red light, we're tickled. We're it's entertaining. You watch this grown man behaving like a child on the floor in the middle of his toys, screaming, whatever. But the truth is that maybe a little bit too often, adults actually do behave like children. Don't you think? Watch how people shout and get all worked up about things. And the faribbles, the reasons that families don't talk or friends have fallouts. Over what? What did you get so worked up about? What was the big deal? As much as we may have matured in the sense of the chesed and the ahava, we don't run after the same nonsense that we used to, although there's still adults who'll push their way into the line of the kids getting their ice cream as well, so they can also get ice cream. It does happen. But I think on the other side, the side of people losing their rag and getting completely worked up, that's probably the biggest area where adults are not necessarily always adults. Why? Because the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, is in the driver's seat. And it behaves like a child, or worse, an animal. Because its staging ground is in midos, personal reactions. without the pause to assess and analyze objectively whether or not this is the right or the healthiest response. Vechein b'isparus. And the next level is what we call isparus, which is the negative flip side of what's called tiferes. Tiferes is a healthy, balanced, compassionate approach to life. Hisparus, which you can hear is from the same word tiferet, hisparus, the same letters, the same words, and therefore implies the same kind of energy. Hisparus is the sense of boastfulness. What do children say to each other? My daddy is stronger than your daddy. That's what they say, right? Or what do they say? I know how to fly. Right? They make up nonsense. The one child's trying to show the other child that he's such a big deal. So you make up a story. My dad allowed me to drive the car. You're only 6 years old. Where did you get this from? Hisparus, they blow these stories out of proportion because there's this immaturity that makes them feel that if I tell a story, maybe it will give me the self-confidence that I lack. And what happens when an adult is driven by the nefesh habahamis? Same thing. Hisparus. Same thing. My soccer team is better than your soccer team. I always have such a laugh when guys arrive at shul in the morning. There was a soccer match the night before, and they say, we played well last night, right? It's like, where were you? Where did you play? Who did you play against? You sat on the couch with a beer in one hand and the remote control in the other hand. What do you mean we? We won. We won the European League or whatever it is, you know? Well, who we? What? What are you talking about? Hisparus, it's the same thing as the little child. My father's bigger than your father. My soccer team is better than your soccer team. In the meantime, it has nothing to do with me. You know, just because I screamed at the TV did not make them win, contrary to popular belief. And likewise, when people invent all kinds of strange things that are not necessarily true, just to have that imagined credibility within society. They inflate the figures of how their business is doing. Or they spin tales about experiences that they've had or people who they know, they name drop or whatever the case is. It's fascinating, right? How we don't necessarily outgrow the fundamental childish perspective. And the reason for that is because the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, is in the driver's seat. And it's not uncommon. This is not an insult. This is not a criticism. It's just an honest self-assessment of the human experience. Most of the time, if we're honest with ourselves, the nefesh habahamis, which is midos-based, the animalistic soul, which is driven by self-serving personal responses to life, is usually our status quo. That's how we respond to life. That's where we come from. Fascinating, right? Fascinating. And the truth is, Oshar Midos, the same thing applies to any of the other Midos, any of the other elements of the person's character. So what have we established so far is that we have two forces that appear to be very similar, but they're actually completely opposite. The one is the structure of the nefesh elikis, the healthy side of ourselves, the divine soul, which has a very healthy 10-phase network of deep and meaningful and challenging, actually, because they challenge us to grow, elements of self. And that's coupled with and almost opposed by another system, which also has 10 points to it, but it's a very haphazard, unhealthy system, which is very much about, how I feel and how I would like to feel and the imagined state of where I am. And this is the tug of war that plays out inside any one of us. Now, remember, we started last week by saying that we want to work out what makes something holy, because that will be our aspiration, versus what makes something unholy, which would make it something we want to try and avoid. So now we understand that there's these dynamics. We haven't yet defined what makes the one set of dynamics healthier than the other. Of course, any thinking person could tell that if something is more mature and if something is capable of objectivity, then it must be better than something which is immature, self-interested, and completely subjective. That makes sense. But that's not yet holy versus unholy. That's just simple maturity versus immaturity. You do not have to learn Tanya to learn the difference between being a mature human and an immature human. I think we're all quite conscious of the fact that we should be at least trying to be mature people. We're now going to present another layer to this conversation, a completely different layer, a spiritual layer to this conversation, which is critical for us because we need to understand the spiritual value of following the nefesh elikis rather than the nefesh habahamis, the divine rather than the animal soul. So first of all, what we need to know is this. Ve'eser bechinois elu hatmeos. So we've described now how the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, has 10 faculties, and they're all impure. We don't yet know what impure is, but they're all impure. So keshe adam mechashev bohen, any time that a person allows their mind to be occupied by the dictates of those 10 faculties that are unhealthy, oy medaber, or any time that a person speaks the language of those 10 faculties that are unhealthy, or oise, or any time that a person does something that is fueled by the unhealthy components of their self, at that time, at that time, the capacity for thought which resides in the brain, and the capacity for speech which resides in the mouth, and the ability for action which is primarily in the hands, because the hands are the most commonly used limbs of action, but by extension in all the other limbs of the body, all of them nikroim levushei mesavoy, they all get the name impure garments. Le'eser bechinois elu hatmeos, impure garments for these 10 impure faculties, shemislapshois bohen b'shas maise oy dibur oy machshava, which the person would be completely enclosed in at the time of the thought or the speech or the action. So let's just understand exactly what's going on over here. One thing we've established already in chapter 4, now we're echoing it as well, is that in order for a soul to be able to interact with the world, it needs an interface. In this case, it's 3 interfaces. There are 3 interfaces available for the soul to be able to interact with and to engage with the world. They're called thought, speech, and action. Now, it goes without saying that action is the most involved and invested in the world, right? When you do something physically, then you are certainly invested in the world. Speech, a little bit less so. And thoughts, we've got to understand that our thoughts actually have an effect on this world. So the term that we're using over here is levushim. Levushim is garments. What is a garment? How do you use a garment? What do you do with a garment? So a garment is something that you put on, you take off at will as you need it. Right? So not only do you put on and take off garments as you need them, but you could wear different garments at different times to serve different purposes. For example, let's say that a person's job, let's say that a person works in a laboratory where they do research about viruses. So you've got to wear protective clothing, right? Something we became very familiar with during COVID, PPE, yes? Got to wear appropriate garments. So what happens when you do when you put on these appropriate garments? You've got to put them on as you need them. You got to take them off. You don't come home in your PPE, right? Got to get rid of them. when it's time to get rid of the garments, get rid of the garments. Well, here's another example. Have you ever looked at what do they call those things? Those diving bells. Not you remember those old diving helmets that people used to use. You know what I'm talking about? Like before scuba. You know those big diving helmets, and you put that thing on, and you've got the weight belt that you've got to put around you, and the flippers. It's an amazing garment to wear in the water. You don't want to try walk around like that on the dry land. It's too clunky, it's too heavy, it's completely inappropriate. Now, when we describe over here these garments, thought, speech, and action, depending on what a person engages with, will determine if their thoughts or their speech or their action will be healthy garments, easy garments, appropriate garments, or heavy, clunky, interfering garments. So what happens? Let's say that a person behaves as dictated to by the nefesh habahamis, by the animal soul. They get angry. Here's a person who's getting angry, they're screaming, they shout, and they go, "Meshuga." In all likelihood, words are going to come out of their mouth that are not nice words. Impure words. That's a big deal in Judaism. Language is a big deal in Judaism. So I remember that there was a time nobody would use bad language in front of a rabbi. It was considered absolutely taboo. Absolutely, because it's so clearly understood that in Judaism, bad language is impure. It's toxic. It's just not acceptable. And things have evolved to the point that you will find people now that do use bad language in front of a rabbi. In other words, we've lost that sensitivity to the concept that this is toxic, not healthy. So that's what he's telling us. When a person uses the gift, thought, speech, and action, which in the previous chapter we learned creates the opportunity for the highest level of connection to Hashem, because when you say words of Torah, or when you think words of Torah, or when you do a mitzvah, those garments then become the catalyst to allow the neshama this amazing connection to God. Here's the flip side. That same faculty of speech, that same brain that thinks, those same parts of the body that act, if they are under the dominion of the animal soul, get dragged right down into the world of impurity. So what should start to emerge over here, just the beginning of a conversation, which we'll clarify between now and the end of the 9th chapter, but what should start to become clear to us is that we get to choose which reality we live in. We get to choose if we're going to live a reality that creates connection to Hashem, meaningful reality, or if we're going to live in a reality that creates barrier to God. And then it's not a meaningful reality. In fact, it's an unhealthy, toxic, draining reality. So let's ask ourselves a question. It's not a nice question to ask. Nobody wants to ask this question. So we get to choose our reality, right? We get to either use the faculties that Hashem has given us to live a meaningful, uplifting, connected, higher reality, or we use those same faculties to allow ourselves to be dragged down into a very mired, unhealthy place. So let's ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. Which do we do more? Which do we do more frequently? Where do we spend most of our time? In the beautiful, holy, pristine, elevated place of connection to Hashem, or in the swamp? Where do we spend more of our time? Says the Alter Rebbe, second line, V'hein neheim kol hamasim asher nasim tachas hashemesh. What we have just described, these unhealthy, toxic behaviors, are all of the behaviors that are so-called under the sun. You remember the famous line of King Solomon, Ein chadash tachas hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. What did he mean? He should have just said there's nothing new in the world. Why say under the sun? Because there are two realities that a person can live in. The reality of so-called under the sun effectively means the reality of the what comes naturally. You want to supersede the natural order, that's a different story. But what comes naturally? The swamp. That's what comes naturally. The default setting of the uneducated human is to live in the swamp. To live with all the toxic behaviors. The unrefined human being gets angry. The unrefined human being behaves terribly when angry. The unrefined human being loves things that actually are not amazing, not so beautiful, not so valuable. All of the activity that goes so-called under the sun, in other words, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is the vast majority of life, nobody naturally floats upwards. The nature is to be drawn down with gravity. So most of life is in the unhealthy space. It's quite something to acknowledge, right? We're always getting upset. We're always getting upset. How come those people hate the Jews? How come those people don't believe the truth? They buy what the media says. How come people are so dishonest? How come? Because the unrefined human being will always follow midos, and midos will always go in, firstly, a very immature way, and secondly, a very self-centered way of pursuing what they believe is going to make them happy, what they believe they deserve to be able to do, to say, etc. That's the default position of our world. Not an elevated place. So we're always disappointed because we as Jewish people are constantly aspiring to something which is greater and higher. So we're consistently disappointed with the fact that the world does not seem to aspire that way at all. People are very happy just to have a whole lot of money and go out and have a good time and maybe conquer the next door neighbor's business, house, wife, country, whatever the case might be. And we're like this voice of morality that says, why? Why? Because we're constantly being tempted and constantly being challenged to rise above. But the default setting of this world is very much beneath the sun. Asher hakoil hevel v'ra'us ruach. Again, paraphrasing from King Solomon, who said, Hevel havolim hakoil hovel. In the beginning of the book of Koheles, Ecclesiastes, where he says that everything is hevel, everything is meaningless. V'ra'us ruach. And everything of the natural state of the world is negative spirit. Or to borrow another expression, as the Zohar famously says, Shehein teviru derucha. It's a broken spirit. So yes, if people turn around and say we live in a broken world, they're not so far off according to the Zohar. It is a broken world. Because Hashem did not design our world that everybody just naturally gravitates to a healthy place. That's what work is all about. The way Hashem designed our world is that we naturally gravitate to unhealthy places. And then we have to learn to buck that trend. You know, it's very interesting in halacha, in the laws of kashrus, in order for a duck to be kosher, it has to be strong enough to swim against the current. If it can't do that, it cannot be kosher. And there's a great message we could extrapolate out of that. In order to be a kosher human being, one has to have the ability to swim against the current, against the natural flow, the natural direction of life. It's no accident that Hashem designed the physical reality to be governed by gravity, where everything is pulled downwards, because that in turn represents the nature of our spiritual reality, that things are pulled downwards. But the greatness of life is that we don't have to live by the natural laws. The greatness of life is that we always have the opportunity to push back, to push upwards, to buck the trend, to transcend, to get in touch with our godly soul, and to become somebody who's completely different to the so-called default setting. So in order to understand exactly how that works, in the next piece, the Alter Rebbe will explain to us what defines something as holy versus what defines something as unholy. And that will give us a template that we could start to use and to apply in our lives to work out how to rise above and how to live a life that is not just meaningful, but a life that is holy, which, please God, will continue next time.